Miner used to say, you make your best photographs when you're exhausted, too tired to stop to take anything that isn't a real photograph.
Hello there. Within the evolution of photography, there have been three photographers who've transformed the way that we approach metaphor within the medium. Alfred Stieglitz through his equivalents. After that came Edward Weston's Carmel work, and lastly Minor White's abstracted close-ups. Metaphor within all art forms, including photography, is now accepted and easily recognized. But between the 1930s and 1950s, photography was just emerging as an art form, and experiments involving the medium's potential to convey metaphorical ideas were considered revolutionary. Concepts surrounding photography's capacity to capture something beyond depiction of reality, like emotions or feelings, opened up new vistas for expression. Minor White was a complex and often troubled character who turned to photography to express his feelings and spiritual explorations. Through his intense engagement with picture making, he believed that he was able to mirror his own emotional states. He extended these ideas beyond the individual image, creating complex pattern connections of ideas and feelings through his sequenced images. The beginning of White's career began when his grandfather gave him his camera equipment and his collection of slides. White never really achieved financial stability within his life. He was too preoccupied with ideas and spiritual development. As he grew as a photographer, he was drawn to the cutting-edge work of that time. Through his connection with Beaumont and Nancy Newell, he met many great photographers like Paul Strand, Edward Steichen, and Harry Callahan. He really wanted to form a connection with Alfred Stieglitz, whose work, especially his equivalent series, had made such a big impression on him. They finally met up in 1946, soon after White had been discharged from the army, after completing his wartime service. They looked at photographs and talked about contemporary photography, but White had many questions about his own direction and whether Stieglitz thought it would be possible for him to become a truly great photographer. Stieglitz looked at him and asked if he had ever been in love. When White answered yes, Stieglitz said, "Then you can take photos." White saw this moment as transformational. He felt inspired, and his belief in life itself and in man was restored. During the war, this conviction had taken a battering. White's struggle with his homosexuality was a key factor in his work. He pretty much remained in the closet his whole life, mainly because during that time there wasn't much tolerance for being openly gay. There was an actual threat that he could have been fired from any of his teaching positions. His first serious wake-up call happened when he was 18. His parents read his private journal, and an unpleasant discussion followed about his thoughts about being homosexual. White discovered that teaching photography was as important for him as photography itself. He felt that it was his vocation. Amusingly, he believed that one important reason for dedicating himself to teaching was so that there would then be other people who could interpret his own photographs.
And he felt that by having an audience, by having people understand, maybe they would understand themselves more, maybe they'd understand him more. I don't want to suggest either. He felt, I remember him saying distinctly, that if we were to continue photographing and we didn't have a group of people around us that knew how to read images, in time, our creative energy would dry up.
He was offered a job as a curator at MoMA, but he wasn't mad about New York, and rather accepted an offer by Ansel Adams to teach photography at the California School of Fine Arts. As Adams did less and less teaching, White became head of the program. He applied Adams's zone system to his work, but while Adams mainly photographed expansive landscapes, White became more and more interested in abstracted details. In the early 1950s, photography magazines were very limited, so White, Adams, and a number of other prominent photographers founded Aperture magazine. White was appointed editor-in-chief, and for 20 years he performed this role without ever being paid. The goal of the magazine was to publish expressive photography, which had its roots in Stieglitz's equivalents. These publications became real works of art with beautiful reproductions. In recent decades, the magazine has become a little more hit and miss. Some issues maintain the same level of inquiry, but others seem to be a little bit of a box-ticking exercise. His own work during this period began to shift towards the metaphorical. He wanted to create images that were charged with symbolism, reflecting universal ideas. He was expanding on what Stieglitz did with his series of clouds, showing that photographs can reflect a deeper state of being. Edward Weston had developed these ideas after moving to Carmel in California. He was able to express his poetic feelings through his photographs of nature. He began to recognize similarities of form in all things: rocks, trees, shells, torsos, and even in peppers. Weston's bell pepper number 30, photographed in 1930, is probably the most famous example of an object transcending its literal thingness. John Sikowski described the picture. I'll paraphrase. Because the pepper is isolated from any reference to the outside world, we observe it without context, allowing it to become as a metaphor for the organic unfolding of life itself. White said that Stieglitz, Weston, and Adams all gave him exactly what he needed at that time. He took different things from each: technique from Ansel, the love of nature from Weston, and from Stieglitz, the affirmation that he was alive and could take photographs. He became close friends with Weston, and the older man had a profound influence on his photography and his philosophical development. White would spend time with Weston photographing at Point Lobos, but the two photographers would approach the subject matter from different viewpoints and with distinct creative objectives. White continued to develop this approach to seeing and photographing. He said, a photograph should reveal the vitality of the poetic experience. He believed that when he was photographing rocks, he was adapting a dual approach. Firstly, even though the rocks themselves remain rocks, the image needed to remind him of something beyond, human anatomy or emotions, and that this process opened a doorway for the viewer to explore the unconscious. Even when he was making a portrait, his process was similar. The camera recorded the person, but it was also possible to reveal the relation between the photographer and the subject. Also, by suggesting the atmosphere of the interaction, this also might be communicated. In his practice, he initially focused on making individual images until he felt, in his words, a storm was brewing. Then he shifted into sequence mode. He approached this part of the process in a similar way to how a composer creates a music score for an orchestra, building layers by creating compound meanings through the juxtapositions within the sequence. For him, the spaces between the images became as important as the linking aspects themselves.
Fascinating for me was watching Miner sequence images. He would lay them out on the floor. He would always bend over at right angles, looking down at the images. You would expect them to be evenly spaced down a wall. He would start spacing and talk about how it needs to have a pause. There needs to be a space. There needs to be a breath here before we continue. So you could have a set of 4 images, and a slightly larger space, and then another 2, and then a space, and then he would continue on with the show. He always felt that the images determined what the spacing needed to be.
It's simply getting into that state and moving from one image to the other and understanding that the images are related to each other. You see a form in one, and then it may be transformed or rotated or moved in some way or changed tonality in the second image. And then you can begin to enter the sequence itself.
All of these ideas were tied to his spiritual development. He became deeply involved in Eastern philosophy. Previously, he had explored religion, both Protestant and Catholic, but his experiences during the war led him to lose his faith. Mysticism, Zen Buddhism, and meditation helped to provide him with a new path to spiritual discovery. There were some colleagues like Ansel Adams who thought that White went too far sometimes in his attempt to integrate spirituality with photography. The faculty at MIT felt that White's photographic course, called Creative Audience, was a little out there. White was determined to increase awareness of how pictures made one feel, sometimes in preference to how pictures could be made.
When looking at an image, one usually does not use the body. It's usually intellect, maybe it strikes an emotion. But Miner in the workshops would sometimes have you dance your reaction to a photograph, not to verbalize it, but to move, or even give a back rub to the person in front of you. But I believe it had to do with his understanding through his searching that there needed to be a combination of the mind, the body, and the emotions, the spirit.
Before dying of a heart attack at age 68, his pictures had become more and more abstract. Black and white close-ups of rocks, wood, and water. The images had become intense and spiritual as he integrated photography into his pursuit of a contemplative life. I hope you enjoyed that work, and I'll see you next time.
Well, Miner White was interested in Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism. He was interested in mysticism. He was interested in Chinese and Japanese ink painting. So he was drawing from a number of sources. There were many things that I learned from him. One of them was the idea of concentration. You would go through the process of relaxing the body, relaxing behind the eyes, letting the relaxation drift down through the body. Then you can apply it. I described it in terms of looking at a single photograph, right? And then what Miner would do is project that forward into making photographs to get into this state, this condition when you're in the field and you're walking, and you're looking, and the quality of your looking, the quality of your vision